Unlike health care, some people on the edges did want to turn the tax cut into a more redistributionist tax cut, and that restrains some of the rate cuts on the individual side. But still, they got the main stuff done.
Yeah. I think actually there's a story about how Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, Democrat, pulled Rob Portman aside and said, look, we'll work with you, we'll come along with you, but you have to make the corporate tax rate 25%. And Portman took that back to the Republicans and they said no. And I think that shows the level of discipline that they decided to adhere to, specifically on the corporate tax rate. I mean, that was the thing they wanted to get done. Everything else that got done in this was sort of built around that. But, you know, the Republicans are different than the Democrats. And the Democrats keep saying that there was this, you know, far right-wing extremism. But there is a difference. Democrats believe in basically socializing the profits, and Republicans believe that you have to create wealth before you try to redistribute it. And their goal here was to change the corporate structure so that there would be more wealth creation. That was a goal that they refused to let go of.
And on that target of the corporate tax cut, Dan, I think you got to give President Trump credit for saying 20% is what I want. And by setting that goal out there and saying we don't want to get away from that, he made it harder for the members of Congress to do what comes naturally to them, which is to water everything down to get a compromise. It finished at 21, but very close to the target.
Yeah, I mean, Congress needs that kind of template. They need something to, you know, work around. And also, I think we should credit the fact that the Republicans kind of knew where the traps were in writing tax legislation. I mean, you go back to former Ways and Means Chairman Dave Camp, I think it was back around 2007, proposed a bill. He was succeeded at Ways and Means by Paul Ryan. They'd been working on this for a long time. It's not as though this was, you know, born out of the ethers. And then, of course, Kevin Brady, an extraordinary Ways and Means chairman, incredibly patient, but they knew where the mistakes, they knew where the dangers were, and they anticipated them. Now, it was hard by the end of it. It was the sausage factory, but this was unlike healthcare, which, as Kate was suggesting, was just an open-ended free-for-all. This one was more disciplined.
Kim, I remember talking to Paul Ryan once, who said, when I was talking at the beginning of this Congress, and he said, look, I've already been through the 20 stages of grief in trying to write a tax bill and dealing with all the trade-offs and all the pain involved in taking away one loophole to get a rate cut. And a lot of the members hadn't. So, but having done that spade work really made a huge difference.
And they have worked on this for a decade at least. And look, I think one thing that's got overlooked in all of this is that when it came down to it, people have focused on some of these big deductions that did get saved in the bill. You know, we still have a mortgage interest deduction, still have the charitable giving deduction, the compromise that they did on SALT, state and local property taxes. But a lot of junk went away. So in that regard, this was a reform, because in the end, that was the only way that they could get, in the end, to those lower rates, was to get rid of a lot of the giveaways and make it a cleaner code. And that's a big victory in this bill as well.
Kim, what do you make of the relationship between Donald Trump and Capitol Hill coming out of this? Do you think what does it tell us about that lesson? Because remember, they didn't work very well together on health care, but on this one they did.
No, the outpouring of love is something to behold from both directions.
Right. And
but I will
some
say
of it's
this,
phony, I must say.
I would say so too. But look, the important message that has come out of this is I think both sides have wondered at times if there's value in working with each other. And what this has shown is that there is value, that the entire party benefits. So those Republicans who've been a little wary of this president, they're still going to go after him when he's off course. But I think some of them were worried that, you know, it wasn't to their benefit to work with him at all. They've changed their mind. And Donald Trump realizes there's no benefit of calling Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan a bunch of establishment phonies. They can get stuff done.
And not a single Democrat, Kate. How do you explain that?
Well, I think in some sense the party has moved left since 1986, when Democrats helped write the 1986 bill, not alone just pass it. You had Bill Bradley from New Jersey, who was proposing lower top rates for exchanging carve-outs, which is now basically essentially a Republican position.
But even in 2001, a dozen Democrats worked with George Bush.
Right. I mean, I think Democrats are betting on even in a better economy, people's personal distaste for Trump and the high intensity of the resistance to him is going to make them turn out and vote for Democrats, and so they don't want anything to do with the tax bill.
I do think that Republicans would be smart to manage expectations. And I think one big mistake the president's making is to talk about the stock market.
Yeah.
Because the stock market is going to behave as it's going to behave, and there's a lot of external factors that could affect it.
Sure.
And that will not mean that the tax reform was not good, but if he ties them together, that will damage people's opinion of the reform.
I think one thing we know, Mary, the stock market is going to go down at some point, and you don't want to be hostage to that politically.
And we'll see next year. You know, people are going to get these tax cuts in their paychecks. The Democrats are relying on opinion polls because the press has been very negative about this. 17% of people think they're not going to get a tax cut. About 80% will. And as that develops over the course of next year, I think attitudes towards this bill are going to change. And Democrats are going to be standing there saying, we were against the whole thing.
All right, still ahead as companies like AT&T, Comcast, and Wells Fargo react to the GOP tax plan. We'll take a closer look at its economic impact in 2018 and beyond.
We're going to see something that's going to be very special. We're bringing the entrepreneur back into this country. We're getting rid of all the knots and all the ties, and we're going to see. You're going to see what happens. And ultimately, what does it mean? It means jobs, 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 jobs.
President Trump touting the economic benefits of the Republican tax cut, promising they'll create jobs and bring entrepreneurs back to the United States. Scott Hodge is president of the Tax Foundation, which released its analysis of the bill this week. Among the highlights, over the next decade, the plan will boost GDP by 1.7%, raise wages by 1.5%, and add 330,000 new jobs. So, Scott Hodge, welcome. Good to have you back. You know,
thank you, Paul.
Scott, I'm looking at that economic impact, and you know, it's not all that large, and it's not as large as some of the prediction, your analysis of some of the proposals, as opposed to this final legislation. What happened in the end to reduce your expectations?
Well, Paul, there are really two economic stories here. One's the long term, and the other is the short term. And as you know, so many provisions in this bill have been sunset after about 7 years that the long-term prospects for growth are quite small. And you're seeing it there in those results. That's really the result of only cutting the corporate tax rate. Now, in the short term, because we have 5 years of temporary full expensing for capital investment, we are seeing a great deal more growth. And that is, in fact, we see the economy growing, instead of 2% growth, about 2.4 to 2.5% growth over the next couple of years. So really, unless we see a lot of those temporary provisions made permanent, we're going to see a lot of this growth taper off at the end of the next decade.
Okay, but as you know, Congress is always elected every 2 years, a new Congress, so they can do what they want with the tax code, and I guarantee you they will.
Sure.
So, but if you're saying that if some of those provisions, like expensing, which only lasts 5 years, if that's extended, then you'll get the greater growth in the future too.
As a good example of that, we modeled this plan as though it were permanent and found that it would boost the long-term level of the economy by 4.7%.
Okay.
So about 3 times what we got because of all the temporary provisions. So there's a great deal of promise here if all of this is made permanent.
Okay, and one of the reasons they didn't make it permanent was because they had to fit all those the numbers inside that 10-year budget window that Congress has concocted for itself. So they can revisit this policy and extend those if need be. I want to deal with you. Talk to you about some of the criticisms that are leveled at this bill. And let's go through them one by one. One of which is that this is really a tax increase on the middle class, as Nancy Pelosi says. Is that true?
No, in fact, everybody gets a tax cut in the middle class. In fact, even the liberal tax policy center Brookings said this plan will knock over 4 million people, low-income people, off the tax rolls, increasing the amount of non-payers to about 48% of all filers. That's incredible. That means that actually this plan is much more progressive than what the left is owning up to.
Okay, now people also say, well, look, the business corporate tax cuts here are permanent, but the middle class tax cuts go away, therefore it favors business.
Well, as you know, lower corporate tax rates eventually translate into higher productivity and higher wages. There's a ton of economic research to show that that's true. And so we're actually showing that wages will rise by at least 1.5%, probably even more as we go on through the next decade.
All right. Now, is this another criticism? Is this an incentive, as the Washington Post wrote, for businesses to move capital overseas because of the new, basically a corporate minimum tax?
Goodness, no. I think that the 21% corporate tax rate will be a tremendous incentive for companies to bring a lot of those activities back. In fact, I think it'll bring a lot of activity from foreign-owned companies to the United States. I think the people that ought to be worried here are the politicians in Germany and France and Japan who have extremely high corporate tax rates now. We've leapfrogged over to them from becoming one of the least competitive countries to now one of the most competitive tax systems in the entire world.
In fact, there's a study out of Germany from last week that suggested exactly that, and I suspect you're going to see Germany and France and maybe other countries cut their corporate tax rates as well to stay competitive. Now, the other big criticism that's leveled here is the deficit. It basically says, you know, it's a 1.5 trillion formal number that they allowed under the tax bill to increase the deficit, and some people say, well, it's going to be much larger than that because of the sunsetting tax provisions that we discussed earlier. What's your response to that?
Well, even with the modest economic growth that our models suggest that this plan will generate, it's going to generate about $5 trillion worth of new GDP over the next decade. And that's going to, in turn, going to produce about $1 trillion worth of new tax revenues for the federal government. So the overall cost of this plan will fall from about $1.5 trillion to less than $500 billion. That's $50 billion a year in order to get $5 trillion worth of new GDP. I think that's a pretty good trade.
But is there a chance that, in fact, it could actually generate more revenue if growth if we get growth up to 3% for 2, 3, 4 years, it's going to be even higher than that?
Oh, certainly, and especially if a lot of these provisions are made permanent, we are going to see that growth continue for as long as the eye can see. And that's all good for both federal treasury and the economy.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. When we come back, despite strong signs that the GOP tax bill will help the economy, polls show that Americans are less than enthusiastic about the plan. So can Republicans sell it to voters ahead of the 2018 midterms?
What this represents is a promise that each and every one of us made to the American people last year is a promise that is kept today.
We have a simple message for our Republican friends. Republicans will rue the day they pass this bill, and you can bet Democrats will make sure of that.
Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill spinning very different tales of the tax cuts. So how will the bill's passage play out in 2018? We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, Kate Batchelder-Odell, and Wall Street Journal columnist William McGurn. All right, Dan, can Republicans sell this thing, and what do they have to do to sell it?
Well, it's not as though they're trying to sell merely an idea. They have passed an enormous tax reform of the entire tax code. They have reduced tax rates, indeed, on the middle class, on corporations. You've got perhaps $2.5 trillion of overseas money being repatriated back to the United States. The economic effects, I think, are going to be pretty significant, and they're going to have to wait until at least mid-year to see what's happening, and then they're going to have to be able to cite that as the result of what they did in passing this bill. Against that, we just saw Chuck Schumer saying this is a disaster. There is an almost mindlessness to the Democrats' opposition on this bill. They're the ones who presided over less than 2% growth for 8 years of the Obama years. You come up to the possibility of rewriting the tax code, and they say we will not participate. Not only will we not participate, they have no alternative other than to oppose what is going on.
Paychecks in February, withholding will increase. Kate, presumably that will help if you actually have a job and you get a more take-home pay. But why is the bill so unpopular now?
Well, I mean, we've had press coverage that, as we've discussed, has been very skewed, and people perceive that they're getting a tax increase when they're not. And yes, we'll sort that out in February. But I think also, it must be fun to be Chuck Schumer and get to predict Armageddon and have no one hold you accountable when it happens.
Or if it doesn't.
If it doesn't happen, excuse me. But also, the left is making this argument. We've seen corporations have said, hey, we're going to give $1,000 bonuses to some of our employees, and the left saying, hey, what's $1,000? And that tells you more about the world they live in than it does the GOP.
Bill, pretty extraordinary this week. I mean, AT&T came out $1,000 bonus for 200,000 employees, right. Comcast for another 100,000 employees. A lot of companies starting to do this, and the response is, oh well, who cares? I mean, that's just PR. Well, you get a $1,000 check.
Well, I think
I'll take it.
Right. I think that gets to the real question for 2018. It's not the political question. A lot of people that would normally vote Democratic put Donald Trump in office because they thought he was going to recover the economy in some way and make their lives better. And the question is whether they feel that. And this $1,000 to dismiss that for families, for mom and dad saying this might be a new TV or piano lessons for someone, that it's really foolish, I think, to dismiss. And if you look at the Democratic, I mean, the party operates this way. They say their stuff, but you're a football player in college. This is the 12th man on the field is the crowd, the press, the coverage of the tax cuts, victims of the Trump tax cuts and so forth. It's mind-boggling.
So go ahead, Kate.
No, and I was just going to add, these bonuses that we're seeing, they're the icing on the cake. What we have been talking about for several months is that when you cut corporate taxes, you spur investment and you make workers more productive. That is what leads to long-term wage growth, not that companies decide to give away more money that they keep directly at the end of the year.
And yet, Kim, we have often seen in some midterm elections, which usually help the opposition for the party in the White House, that sometimes a faster economy, faster growth doesn't necessarily translate into votes if the president himself is unpopular. So that's still a risk here for the Republicans.
Correct. And the time frame here is short in that, look, this bill will have some immediate effects. We've seen that from corporations, and it will help long-term growth or longer-term growth. How quickly that kicks in and the sense of well-being that a growing economy leaves with people, and can they connect that to a president who on a daily basis often manages to offend people. We just saw what happened when you had the president and his poor approval ratings hanging around the neck of Ed Gillespie, who was the Republican running for governor in Virginia, and he lost and lost fairly badly in a state that should have been gettable. So this is, I think, the bigger question is, can the Republicans running in the midterms run on that tax success without necessarily running hip and hip with an unpopular president if he still is at that point?
Yeah, and it's going to affect politics next year. The Republicans talked about wanting to reform Medicare and Social Security. Mitch McConnell said at the end of the week, I'm not doing that unless I have Democratic support, taking a big piece of legislative activity off the table.
All right, still ahead, Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe grilled on Capitol Hill this week. His testimony reportedly raising more questions than answers as Republican lawmakers get set to issue new subpoenas in the Russia probe. New developments this week in the Russia probe as Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe faced 2 days of questioning on Capitol Hill, and according to House intelligence sources, his closed-door testimony before that committee on Tuesday raised more questions than it answered. Congressional investigators say McCabe's 7-hour testimony conflicted with statements from previous witnesses, prompting Republicans to mull new subpoenas for FBI and Justice Department staff. We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Bill McGurn. So, Kim, what is the big takeaway here from the McCabe testimony? What should we know about it?
The biggest one is what Republicans did or did not learn about this infamous dossier and the FBI and DOJ's use of that in their decision to launch a counterintelligence probe into President Trump.
This is a Steele dossier, the so-called Steele dossier.
The Steele. Yes, that was commissioned by the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign. McCabe was asked about what they did, and he was at great pains to stress all the efforts that the FBI and DOJ went to corroborate some of the allegations in it. But what's interesting here is apparently, in the end, he had to admit that the only thing that they could find in it that was true was that a Trump satellite operator, Carter Page, once traveled to Russia. Nothing else. So I think that raises more questions because if they couldn't find anything true in it, were they nonetheless still using it as part of a probe or as a justification for getting wiretaps on Trump campaign officials?
And Carter Page has admitted he took a trip to Moscow.
Right. If this is the only thing they had, then the question is, what did they use, if they used it at all, in the application for a FISA warrant? I think Congress...
Which is extraordinary. Just step back for a second. They basically asked a court, if it's true, based on a dossier commissioned by the opposition campaign, to have the FBI able to spy on a presidential campaign.
Almost a year and a half later, the assistant FBI director can verify only one fact, the travel fact about Clarence Page. It's really outrageous. The House, other committees are becoming involved, oversight, judiciary, and they need to see the FBI files. There's a file in this case. They need to see those files. The other larger question is, the more the investigation goes on, the more the questions are about the investigators. It doesn't mean that Bob Mueller's dishonest. But when he first assembled this team, remember we were told these are strict professionals. These are people very professional. They're entitled to their opinions. And we have an FBI agent who's supposed to be a counterintelligence guy squawking to his mistress, you know, about Trump and opening himself up to all sorts of vulnerability to blackmail with an affair. We've got Andrew Weissman, who, you know, applauded an Obama holdover for defying a presidential order. We got Bruce Orr, his wife is working for the people that produced the document. I mean, do you get the word professional when you read those actions? And it's, I think they're largely discrediting themselves.
But none of this, of course, relates to the to the central question, Dan, of collusion. And
yeah,
Senator
exactly.
Mark Warner, who is the ranking Democrat on Senate Intelligence, said this week that he thinks actually there's more fire than smoke, and he's not releasing any details, but he thinks this is the biggest thing he's ever going to do in his professional career. And he warned the president, if you fire Mueller, this is a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, well, coming up with sayings here, there's a little boy who cried wolf over and over again when there was no wolf, and no one would believe him. I mean, after listening to Bill go through all of these issues, roll back to why we are here. Way back in January, the story of collusion emerged, and every media outlet in Washington, the allegation, every media outlet in Washington was running stories based on anonymous intelligence sources that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Then we get a special prosecutor. We roll all the way up here to December. One of the top officials of the FBI, McCabe, goes and appears before Congress, and the best he can give them is that Carter Page visited somebody in Russia. So both the members of Congress and these committees and the American people are at the point of asking, what is going on here with this investigation? Why haven't we reached a closure or a more...
Further to Dan's point, go back at the beginning. Devin Nunes was ridiculed.
He is the chairman of the House Intelligence
was
Committee.
ridiculed on a crazy man for what he was doing. They trumped up some charges against him in the Ethics Committee, which were dismissed, but designed to handicap the investigation. Look, I think the House and Senate are getting close to answers. And if you watch the hearings now, and you watch, for example, Christopher Wray deal with Congress.
The FBI director now.
FBI director, and so Rod Rosenstein. Congress wants the documents. They have a right to the documents. It's extraordinary that we have federal agencies telling the elected representatives of the American people that they can't see the documents they need to do their job to override. I think there's more subpoenas coming, and I think there's going to be some contempt findings if they don't turn this around.
Do you think, briefly, Bill, that the Democrats want Trump to fire Mueller?
Oh, absolutely. Why would Donald Trump fire Mueller now when his team has all become the subject of discussion? I mean, I think he has the constitutional authority to do it, but I don't think
it would be
wise, unprudent to do it at this point. And now we need more questions about the investigators.
All right, still ahead. Amid rising global threats, the president outlined his administration's national security strategy this week. What it tells us about the emerging Trump doctrine next.
We face rogue regimes that threaten the United States and our allies. We face terrorist organizations transnational criminal networks, and others who spread violence and evil around the globe. We also face rival powers, Russia and China, that seek to challenge American influence, values, and wealth. We will attempt to build a great partnership with those and other countries, but in a manner that always protects our national interest.
That was President Trump outlining his administration's national security strategy this week in a speech that identified the growing global threats to the United States and called out key national rivals by name. So what does it tell us about the emerging Trump foreign policy doctrine, and does the rhetoric match the administration's actions so far? Let's ask Cliff May. He is president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Good to see you again, Cliff. What's the biggest takeaway we should have from the president's new strategy?
It strikes me as hard-headed, realistic, coherent, very different from President Obama's last national security strategy.
How different? Why is it different? How?
So I would say in this way, President Obama essentially believed that America's role was to lead the international community from behind and allow the arc of history to bend towards justice. I would say that President Trump believes that we should be leading from the front our allies. We should be worrying about the military threats we face from rogue regimes as well as revisionist powers, and that if the arc of history is going to bend, we're going to have to bend it.
You know, I think that the striking thing there is the revisionist powers reference in my estimation. He mentioned two countries by name, China and Russia. He said they are attempting to change the global order. They are attempting acts that are contrary to American interests, and we need to counter them as competing powers. Now, that's very different than President Obama. Do you agree with, I mean, is he right in identifying those two countries? Are they the main threats?
They are the main threats. They may not be the most imminent threats, but they're the main threats. China is clearly a long-term threat and has very important plans for it to be the hegemon of Asia and then to go beyond that, the things they're doing in other parts of the world. Russia is much weaker than China, but Russia is not, as President Obama thought, a country with which we can get along if we just reset relations, and because we have loads of common interests. Keep in